Thank you for joining me for the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is day 271 for Sunday, September 27th, 2020, focusing on Zechariah chapters 1 through 5. We enter another book of the Bible. This one fits very well after Haggai. Just like the book of Haggai, the book of Zechariah is set during the reign of King Darius the Mede. He was one of the rulers of the Babylonian Empire, technically from Media, but all of those, Assyria and Babylon and Media, all of these regions, these groups, these different areas came into possession of this same kind of unified empire. And so King Darius was mentioned in Haggai. During the second year in the 6th and 7th month was when Haggai had Haggai's prophecies. And this we see in the 8th month. So we see that the prophet Zechariah is functioning right after Haggai. A vision in chapter 1 references the 70 years. This is the concept that was taken from the prophet Jeremiah, who proclaimed that Jerusalem would have to go into exile 70 years there at the hands of the Babylonians. Thus, the end of the exile is near, which would place the book around the time of the end of the exile, which would be around 539 BCE. That's a significant date because that's when Cyrus the Persian allows for the exiles in Babylon to return back to Jerusalem. And so it's around this time period of 539 BCE. Now, the first line of chapter 1 in Zechariah immediately sets it after Haggai. And so also I should take a note too, before we dive into that chapter 1, verse 1, that Zechariah contains many prophetic visions. And there are several prophetic visions given here in the book of Zechariah. And all of these visions are both cryptic, a little more difficult to understand. That's very similar of the apocalyptic style of literature. The apocalyptic style of literature means that it is something that is veiled, that has been lifted. And so the apocalyptic style is that you remove the veil from this mysterious vision in order to give it explanation and meaning and insight for the reader. Now, in our day and time, we're not meant to be the reader per se. This was originally written to its context there in 539-ish BCE. So it was speaking to what was happening in their day and time, but it's also because of some explanations by the angels and within the text, we have a little bit more insight that we can glean for ourselves as well, too. Anyways, moving on to Zechariah chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo, saying." So the message that Zechariah gets is in verse 3, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. Do not be like your ancestors." And especially their immediate ancestors, all the kings of the line of Israel and Judah, started worshiping other gods. And especially they worshiped the gods of Assyria and they worshiped the gods of Babylon. And so because of this, they fell into the power of the Babylonians. That's why God allowed it through the ideas here in the Old Testament. But then they are captured and exiled, and in fact, they do hear the message, and they listen and seek to be transformed. They don't want to repeat the exile. They want to turn their hearts to God fully. And so then that's the setting in which we get the visions. So the first vision is the vision of horsemen. In verse 8, "In the night I saw a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses." So these visions remind me a lot of the visions of the book of Daniel, which is in the same ballpark time period. Daniel a little bit before it because he's there in the exile of that. But there are also angels that accompany these visions. And the angels appear to God without, appeal, I should say, to God about the suffering of the people of Jerusalem. And God responds with, quote, gracious and comforting words. God expresses anger with the oppressive nations and seeks to restore Israel and Judah. In verse 16, therefore, thus says the Lord, I have returned to Jerusalem with compassion. My house shall be built in it, says the Lord of hosts, and the measuring lines shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. So this book is also, like the book of Haggai, prophetic vision talking about restoring the temple, restoring worship, bringing people in all nations back to God. And so that way God's glory can be magnified. Now, when we see the visions of four horns, again, imagery that's used in the book of Daniel, we also see imagery that's new of four blacksmiths. So these are smiths of destruction, and they are ones who are into smashing things. Thus, these are compared to the nations that have, quote, in verse 21, lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter its people. So will these four horns, these four blacksmiths, succeed? Ultimately, they will not. So in Zechariah 2, verse 1, Zechariah says, I looked up and saw a man with a measuring line in hand. This vision is of a man who comes to measure Jerusalem. And the message is that the walls really will not be as important as God's presence. In verse 4 of chapter 2, Jerusalem shall be inhabited like villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and animals in it. For I will be a wall of fire around it, says the Lord, and I will be the glory within it. Because God promises to bring a safe and protective presence to Jerusalem, the message becomes, in verse 9, up, escape to Zion, you that live with daughter Babylon. And then in verse 9, see now, I am going to raise up my hand against them, and they shall become plunder for their own slaves. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. So this coming of the Lord will allow for the people who plundered them to be plundered, and will draw many to Jerusalem, including other nations. In Zechariah 3, verse 1, it says, then he showed me the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. So how does God handle the accusations of Satan that the high priest has been unfaithful? Well, God removes Satan and also absolves the guilt of Joshua for having been close to Satan and all the accusations that Satan accused of him. In Zechariah 3, verse 4, the angel said to those who were standing before him, take off, this is Joshua's, filthy clothes. And he said to him, see, I have taken away your guilt from you, and I will clothe you with festal apparel. So the high priest, Joshua, is removed of his filthy clothing, and he has this righteousness and this holy garment put upon him, which sounds very similar to a lot of the Lutheran theology, which talks about imputed righteousness, this idea that this righteousness, especially through Jesus, takes away our sin, and we get to wear Christ's holiness. So this is an Old Testament example of that point. This righteousness is given to Joshua, but then God instructs him to keep all of God's ordinances faithfully from this point on. God additionally promises a single day of restoration with the coming of a figure of deliverance. In Zechariah 3, verse 8, I am going to bring my servant, the branch. So the servant's name is the branch. What a strange name to have for a servant. Again, here, I think it's okay for Christians to view this as deliverance from both the 70 years of exile in Babylon, but also as a reference to God's upcoming activity in Jesus. This is in part why a lot of these minor prophets are set up right before we engage with the New Testament, which will be coming up this week. So the Gospels, starting with the Gospel of Matthew, we will talk about how all of these connections lead into Jesus. In Zechariah chapter 4, we again have another vision, this time with a lampstand and 2 olive trees. Now, lampstand was a common figure, a common piece of worship there in the temple of the Lord. And remember, the lampstand was one that was built with the 7 candles. That's why the menorah, they're used for Hanukkah, has 8 candles on it. It does not want to conflict with the 7 candles that were used there in the place of worship. It was not meant to be an idol to replace the sanctity of this lampstand that was there in worship in the temple of the Lord. And so it's pretty important to know the lampstand, also olive trees, because the oil was used there in worship as well. So this imagery, to me, speaks of imagery of worship here in Zechariah chapter 4. So let's dive into this vision in verse 2. And he said to me, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see a lampstand all of gold with a bowl on top of it, and there are 7 lamps on it, and 7 lips on each of the lamps that are on top of it. And by it there are 2 olive trees, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left." Now these symbols are explained in verse 8 and 9. The symbols seem to indicate that Zerubbabel will lead the rebuilding efforts of the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. So in verse 9, "The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands shall also complete it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you." The Lord also mentions 7 eyes in the world, and also 2 anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth. So 7 eyes, this 7-minute candle, also 2 anointed ones, these 2 olive trees. I wonder who the 2 anointed ones are. This does not fit as well with Christian narrative, which talks about Jesus as the anointed one, but at the same time, remember, the anointed one is just the ones chosen by God for God's specific purposes. So we will see again, and maybe you can come up with who you think those 2 are. I have some ideas, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So in Zechariah chapter 5, the visions continue, this time with a flying scroll. So in verse 1, "Again I looked up and saw a flying scroll." So in verse 4, Zechariah continues to hear the Lord of hosts' words. "I have sent it out, says the Lord of hosts, and it shall enter the house of a thief, and the house of anyone who swears falsely by my name. And it shall abide in that house and consume it, both timber and stone." So this is a very special scroll that bears judgment and recounts judgment upon unjust houses. So beyond the scroll, another vision is given here in verse 7. "Then a leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting inside a basket. And he said, 'This is wickedness.' So he thrust her back into the basket and pressed the leaden weight down on its mouth of the basket." Now this basket is removed and taken to the land of Shinar, which is the land of Babylon. So the idea is that Babylon is the source of wickedness, and also that the destruction that comes with rectifying wickedness is in store for Babylon. The wickedness will not reside in the restored Jerusalem, and the people of God will get to live in God's righteous presence with, just like the high priest Joshua, having that garment, that holiness placed upon them, because God's presence will be their holiness. So this will ensue with a time of justice and peace. And that is a wonderful hope to live in, that wickedness is removed and that justice and peace abound, especially in the place that you want to live. So may you get to experience that, God's righteousness, God's holiness, and peace wherever you live, and may God's presence be with you always.